Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, kick off your shoes, and find that perfect spot on the pillow. Tonight we're going to take a very slow, very quiet look at something surprisingly cozy. We're drifting back to the Great Plains and the eastern woodlands to figure out how people managed to get a decent night's sleep in a world before central heating, down comforters, and those expensive weighted blankets. We're talking about the teepee, the wigwam, and the absolute logistical nightmare of trying to stay warm when it's negative 20 degrees outside and your walls are made of buffalo skin. Because honestly, if you or I tried this without the right intel, we'd be frozen popsicles by midnight. But they had it down to a science, a very smoky, very specific science. So let's just float into the world of the 18th century Great Plains. Imagine the wind is absolutely howling outside. It's that sharp, biting wind that feels like it's personally offended by your existence. But inside a teepee, things were actually all right. You see, the teepee wasn't just a tent in the way we think of those flimsy nylon things from the sporting goods store that collapse if a squirrel sneezes on them. No, these were aerodynamic masterpieces of thermal engineering. Of course, they were made of bison hides, because if you're living on the plains, you use what's available, and there were a lot of bison and a lot of wind. The first thing you have to understand about not freezing to death is the liner. This is the secret sauce. If you just had one layer of leather, the draft would be miserable. But they used an inner lining that went about 6 feet up the wall. This created a dead air space, basically a 19th century version of double-paned glass. It kept the dampness out and the heat in. And because the teepee is a tilted cone, it didn't just stand there, it leaned into the wind. It was literally designed to let the gale force winds slide right over it, while the people inside were probably just sitting there, judging the weather from the safety of a fox fur blanket. And then there's the fire. You can't have a cozy sleep without a fire. But having a fire inside a tent sounds like a great way to not wake up at all. Yet they had these smoke flaps at the top. They were like little ears that you could adjust with long poles. If the wind shifted, you just moved the pole and the smoke would keep drawing out perfectly. It was a constant low-energy ritual. Keeping the fire small was the key. You didn't want a bonfire. You wanted a polite, consistent glow. If you made it too big, you'd melt your own face off. If you made it too small, well, the toes go first. Speaking of toes, let's talk about the bedding, because why use one blanket when you can use the entire animal kingdom? We're talking layers, buffalo robes with the fur still on, facing inward. That's the pro tip. You want the fur against your skin because it traps the body heat in these tiny little pockets of air. It's essentially the same technology as a high-end puffer jacket, just a lot heavier, and it occasionally smells like a wet dog. But it wasn't just about the gear, it was about the physics of the floor. You don't just sleep on the grass. That's how the earth steals your warmth. They used willow backrests and raised beds, or at the very least, thick layers of dry grass and furs to create a barrier. It's all about the layers, really. The whole lifestyle was a masterclass in thermal layering. Let's drift over to the eastern woodlands for a moment, where the wigwam reigned supreme. These weren't portable like the teepees because, frankly, carrying buffalo hides through a dense forest sounds like a chore no one wanted. Instead, they used birch bark. Birch bark is nature's styrofoam, waterproof, lightweight, and surprisingly good at reflecting heat. They would wrap these domed structures in layers of birch and woven mats. Inside, the air stayed thick and warm. It probably smelled of cedar, wood smoke, and a hint of "I haven't showered in 3 months," but when it's snowing in the Ohio River Valley, you don't care about the smell. You care about the fact that your nose isn't falling off. And then there were the bedfellows. In many cultures, sleeping was a communal activity. Not in a weird way, just in a "we're all warm-blooded mammals and we should utilize that" kind of way. Dogs were often part of the equation. If it was a 2-dog night, it was cold. If it was a 3-dog night, you were in trouble. The dogs got a warm place to stay, and the humans got a furry, snoring space heater. It was a win-win, unless the dog had a dream and kicked you in the ribs.
The irony of it all is that European explorers were huddling in drafty wooden cabins, shivering their way through the New World winters. The indigenous people were often perfectly comfortable. They had thousands of years of R&D behind them. They knew that if you stayed dry and stayed low, the winter was just a long season for storytelling and catching up on sleep. So, as you're lying there now, maybe under a polyester blend or a cotton sheet, just imagine the sound of the wind hitting that buffalo hide. Imagine the soft crackle of a small willow wood fire and the smell of toasted corn and cedar. It's dark, it's quiet, and despite the blizzard outside, the air around you is perfectly still. You're wrapped in 3 layers of fur, your feet are tucked under a dog, and the world is exactly as it should be.
The logistics of the deep freeze. So, we've established that the teepee and the wigwam were essentially high-tech thermopods, but now we have to look at the actual mechanics of surviving a night when the mercury drops so low that the trees start to literally explode from the sap freezing inside them. It's one thing to have a nice tent. It's another to manage the logistics of a 12-hour night in the dead of a Great Lakes winter. This wasn't just about luck. It was a calculated, rhythmic dance with the cold. If you messed up the order of operations, you weren't just uncomfortable, you were a cautionary tale for the rest of the tribe. Let's talk about the 3-dog night. You've probably heard the phrase, but for the nomadic tribes of the North, this wasn't just a metaphor or a band name, it was a literal measurement of temperature. Dogs were the original central heating system. These weren't the pampered poodles we see today. These were hardy, thick-furred working dogs. On a mildly chilly night, you might just have one dog curled up at your feet. On a night where the wind is screaming across the frozen tundra, you'd bring in 2 or 3. The heat exchange was efficient. The dog gets the benefit of being inside, away from the wolves, and you get a 101-degree heater that doesn't require you to chop any extra wood. Of course, the downside is that you're sleeping in a small space with 3 very furry, very dusty animals. But when the alternative is frostbite, you learn to appreciate the smell of a damp canine. And then there was the fire management. This is where the monotone life really kicked in. You couldn't just load up a giant log and go to sleep for 8 hours. Firewood was precious, especially on the plains where trees were few and far between. You often used buffalo chips, which is just a polite way of saying dried poop. It burns surprisingly hot and slow with a very steady blue flame, but it requires attention. Usually someone, often an elder or someone who didn't mind the night watch, would keep the fire ticking over. It was a low, flickering glow that kept the frost from forming on the inside of the hide walls. The smoke flaps we mentioned earlier, those were basically the thermostat. If you felt a draft, you'd use the exterior poles to snug the flaps shut against the wind. If the air got too heavy or stuffy, you'd open them a crack. It was a constant, gentle adjustment. Imagine being half asleep and hearing the soft thump-thump of the hide flaps adjusting to the wind. It's the ultimate white noise. It's the sound of survival, but a very sleepy version of it. Now let's float over to the concept of thermal mass. In the permanent winter villages, especially among groups like the Mandan or the Haudenosaunee in their longhouses, they use the earth itself. Earth is a fantastic insulator. They would build these lodges with thick timber frames and then cover the entire thing in layers of grass and a foot or more of earth. By the time the first snow fell, the lodge was basically a man-made hill. The snow would then pile up on top, adding another layer of insulation. Snow is actually about 90% trapped air, making it one of the best insulators in nature. So, while the blizzard was raging outside, inside the earth lodge, it might stay a consistent 50 or 60 degrees just from the collective body heat of the families and the central fire. It was dark, it was earthy, and it was incredibly quiet. You wouldn't hear the wind at all. You'd just hear the rhythmic breathing of 30 of your closest relatives. It was the ultimate communal nap. But what about the moisture? That's the real killer in the cold. If you sweat under your furs and that sweat freezes, you're in trouble. This is why the material of the bedding was so specific. They favored brain-tanned leather and specific furs like beaver or rabbit.
Rabbit fur is incredibly soft, but it sheds, so it was often used for baby linings. For the adults, it was all about the bison. A bison robe is thick, heavy, and naturally water repellent. They would sleep with the fur side in, but they'd also wear loose-fitting clothing made of softened deerskin. The goal was to keep the air moving just enough around the skin so moisture wouldn't trap, but not so much that you lost your core heat. It's a delicate balance, like trying to find the cold side of the pillow, but for your entire body. The ironic part of this whole staying warm saga is how much effort went into the floor. We think of floors as just something to stand on, but in a winter camp, the floor was the primary enemy. The cold seeps up from the ground. To combat this, they didn't just throw a rug down, they built platforms. Sleeping elevated just a few inches off the frozen dirt made a massive difference. It allowed the warm air from the fire to circulate under the bed. In the Southwest, among the Pueblo peoples, they'd use heated stones. They would wrap stones that had been sitting near the fire in scraps of old leather and tuck them at the foot of their sleeping mats. It's essentially a 500-year-old hot water bottle. Imagine the feeling of a warm, smooth river stone against your cold toes while the desert stars are blazing outside. It's enough to make anyone drift off. There was also a psychological element to the winter sleep. For many tribes, the winter was the time of telling. This was when the big, epic stories were shared, the ones that were too sacred or too long to tell during the busy summer months. You'd be tucked into your furs, the fire would be a low orange pulse in the center of the room, and an elder would be speaking in a low, rhythmic cadence. The stories weren't meant to be exciting or fast-paced. They were meant to be absorbed. The repetition of the words, the crackle of the fire, and the warmth of the communal space created this deep, heavy sense of security. Even the way they handled midnight snacks was optimized for sleep. They'd eat high-fat foods like pemmican, a mix of dried meat, fat, and berries. Fat is a slow-burning fuel. It keeps your metabolism running throughout the night, which in turn generates internal heat. So you'd have your pemmican, your warm stone, your 2 dogs, and a 3-layer bison wrap. At that point, the blizzard outside isn't a threat. It's just background noise. Of course, it wasn't always a Pinterest-perfect cozy night. Sometimes the wind would shift and blow smoke back into the lodge, or a dog would decide it wanted to be the alpha of the blanket. But compared to the European settlers, who were often trying to survive in drafty cabins with modern, thin blankets, the indigenous methods were vastly superior. They didn't fight the winter, they invited it in, draped it in leather, and went to sleep. As we move into the next part of our story, we'll look at the specific clothes they wore to bed, because you couldn't just wear your day clothes. There was a whole nighttime wardrobe designed specifically for thermal regulation. But for now, just think about that heavy bison robe. Think about how heavy and warm it feels. The world outside is white and frozen, but inside your little cone of leather and wood, you are perfectly, unreachably warm.
The nighttime wardrobe and the herbal drift. So we've covered the architecture and the communal warmth of the dogs, but now we have to get into the literal thread count of the ancient world. When you're preparing for a night where the temperature might drop 30 degrees in an hour, what you wear to bed is essentially your last line of defense. It wasn't about fashion, obviously, and it wasn't even about comfort in the way we think of soft silk pajamas. It was about creating a microclimate around your skin that stayed at a constant, sleepy 98 degrees, regardless of the chaos happening outside the teepee walls. The first rule of the winter sleep was never sleep in the clothes you wore during the day. If you'd been out hunting or gathering wood, or even just moving around the camp, your clothes had trapped a tiny amount of moisture from your body. In the summer, that's fine. In the winter, that moisture is a death sentence. As soon as your heart rate drops for sleep, that dampness turns into a cold, clammy weight that sucks the heat right out of your bones. So the evening ritual involved a complete change into dry gear. This was usually the oldest, softest deerskin clothing, leather that had been worked and smoked so many times it felt more like velvet than animal hide.
For the women and children, this often meant long gowns or tunics made of 2 elk skins joined at the shoulders. For the men, it was leggings and a loose shirt. But the real MVP of the nighttime wardrobe was the moccasin. Not the thin, decorative ones you see in museums, but the winter buffalo moccasins. These were made with the fur left on the inside. Imagine sliding your feet into a pair of shoes that are essentially 2 warm, furry clouds. They would often stuff these with dried buffalo grass or cattail fluff for extra insulation. Your feet are the furthest thing from your heart, so they're the first to get cold. By packing them in fur and grass, you ensured that your toes stayed toasty even if the fire died down to a glimmer. But staying warm isn't just a physical act, it's a chemical one. Before heading into the deep sleep of a midwinter night, many tribes across the eastern woodlands and the plains utilized the local pharmacy, the roots and leaves of the earth, to help the body relax and the blood flow. Because if you're tense from the cold, your muscles cramp and you don't sleep deeply. And deep sleep is where the body does its best heat-regulating work. One of the most common nightcaps was a tea made from the roots of the valerian plant, or wild bergamot. Now, wild bergamot has this lovely citrusy, minty smell, but it also contains thymol, which is a natural relaxant. Drinking a warm cup of this by the fire didn't just warm your stomach, it sent a signal to your nervous system that the day was over. It slowed the nighttime wardrobe and the herbal drift. So we've covered the architecture and the communal warmth of the dogs, but now we have to get into the literal thread count of the ancient world. When you're preparing for a night where the temperature might drop 30 degrees in an hour, what you wear to bed is essentially your last line of defense. It wasn't about fashion, obviously, and it wasn't even about comfort in the way we think of soft silk pajamas. It was about creating a microclimate around your skin that stayed at a constant, sleepy 98 degrees, regardless of the chaos happening outside the teepee walls. The first rule of the winter sleep was never sleep in the clothes you wore during the day. If you'd been out hunting or gathering wood, or even just moving around the camp, your clothes had trapped a tiny amount of moisture from your body. In the summer, that's fine. In the winter, that moisture is a death sentence. As soon as your heart rate drops for sleep, that dampness turns into a cold, clammy weight that sucks the heat right out of your bones. So the evening ritual involved a complete change into dry gear. This was usually the oldest, softest deerskin clothing, leather that had been worked and smoked so many times it felt more like velvet than animal hide. For the women and children, this often meant long gowns or tunics made of 2 elk skins joined at the shoulders. For the men, it was leggings and a loose shirt. But the real MVP of the nighttime wardrobe was the moccasin. Not the thin, decorative ones you see in museums, but the winter buffalo moccasins. These were made with the fur left on the inside. Imagine sliding your feet into a pair of shoes that are essentially 2 warm, furry clouds. They would often stuff these with dried buffalo grass or cattail fluff for extra insulation. Your feet are the furthest thing from your heart, so they're the first to get cold. By packing them in fur and grass, you ensured that your toes stayed toasty even if the fire died down to a glimmer. But staying warm isn't just a physical act, it's a chemical one. Before heading into the deep sleep of a midwinter night, many tribes across the eastern woodlands and the plains utilized the local pharmacy, the roots and leaves of the earth, to help the body relax and the blood flow. Because if you're tense from the cold, your muscles cramp and you don't sleep deeply. And deep sleep is where the body does its best heat-regulating work. One of the most common nightcaps was a tea made from the roots of the valerian plant, or wild bergamot. Now, wild bergamot has this lovely citrusy, minty smell, but it also contains thymol, which is a natural relaxant. Drinking a warm cup of this by the fire didn't just warm your stomach, it sent a signal to your nervous system that the day was over. It slowed the heart and dilated the blood vessels slightly, allowing that core heat to reach your extremities. It was the original calm aid. Of course, they didn't have ceramic mugs. They used bowls carved from birch knots or horn, which held the heat much longer than a modern glass would. Then there was the use of cedar. Cedar wasn't just for building, it was for the soul of the sleep. They would often toss a few sprigs of dried cedar right before bed. The smoke is thin, sweet, and incredibly relaxing. It acted as a mild sedative, but it also cleared the air of any dampness. Imagine lying there, wrapped in your bison robe, smelling the sharp, clean scent of cedar, and listening to the rhythmic, low-tone murmuring of the camp settling down. It's a sensory experience designed to lower your blood pressure and guide you into a state where the cold simply doesn't matter anymore. Let's talk about the kids for a second, because keeping a toddler warm in a blizzard is a full-time job. Indigenous mothers were experts at nesting. They would create moss bags or cradle boards lined with the softest materials imaginable, usually the downy fluff from milkweed pods or very finely shredded cedar bark. This material was highly absorbent and incredibly insulating. The baby would be wrapped tightly, almost like a little burrito, and then tucked into the furs with the mother. This swaddling wasn't just to keep them from wiggling, it kept their body heat concentrated. A warm baby is a quiet baby, and a quiet baby means everyone else gets to sleep through the winter night. The ironic thing about the civilized world's view of this is that they often saw these people as roughing it out. But if you look at the journals of early explorers, they were the ones crying in their tents. They had wool blankets that got heavy and frozen when wet. They had tight boots that restricted circulation. Meanwhile, a Cheyenne family was lounging on a bed of willow branches, covered in a 10-pound bison robe, drinking mint tea and feeling quite smug about the whole situation. There was also a specific way of breathing that was taught. You didn't breathe through your mouth in the cold. You breathed deeply through your nose. This warmed the air before it hit your lungs, preventing that chest chill that can lead to coughing. It was a meditative, slow breath, the kind of breathing you do when you're listening to a long, boring story that you've heard 100 times before. And as the night progressed and the fire turned to white ash, the teepee itself would shrink. The leather would tighten in the cold, pulling the structure even more taut against the wind. The silence of a winter camp is something we can't really replicate today. No hum of electricity, no distant cars, just the sound of the earth freezing and the occasional crack of a lake's ice shifting miles away. In that silence, the warmth of the furs and the presence of your family felt like a fortress. You'd find yourself drifting off, not because you were exhausted from fighting the cold, but because you were so perfectly insulated from it. Your dry deerskin pajamas are soft against your skin. Your fur-lined moccasins are like heaters for your feet, and the faint scent of cedar is still hanging in the air. The world outside is a white, howling void, but inside you are in a cocoon of history, tradition, and very, very thick animal hair. As we move into the next part, we're going to explore what happened when the sleep was interrupted, the midnight rituals of the fire keepers, and how they managed to keep the camp safe from predators and the creeping frost without ever fully waking up. But for now, just let that bison robe get a little heavier. Feel the warmth of the bergamot tea in your chest. The winter is long, but you are very, very cozy.
The midnight watch and the spirit of the embers. So we've reached the deepest part of the night, the time when the fire has settled into a low, pulsing glow and the world outside has gone completely, unnervingly silent. This is the hour where the cold tries its hardest to find a way in. In a modern house, this is when the furnace kicks on with a loud hum, but in a winter camp on the edge of the woods, the furnace was a living, breathing responsibility. This brings us to the midnight fire keepers. You see, sleeping through the night wasn't always a passive act, it was a shared vigil,
a slow-motion relay race where the prize was simply waking up with all your fingers and toes intact. In many indigenous households, especially during a particularly brutal cold snap, the sleep was never truly total. There was usually one person, often an elder whose internal clock had shifted with age, or perhaps a younger person learning the rhythms of the hearth, who acted as the guardian of the embers. This wasn't a stressful job. It was a meditative, quiet task. They would sit wrapped in a heavy robe, watching the way the ash formed over the coals. If the fire got too low, the air would sharpen and you'd feel that first little bite of frost on your nose. Before that happened, the firekeeper would gently, almost silently, add a few more sticks of slow-burning hardwood or another handful of dried buffalo chips. The trick was to keep the fire small but honest. A big fire was dangerous. It could spark and land on a dry fur or create too much turbulent air that sucked the warmth out of the teepee. A small, concentrated bed of coals, however, acted like a radiator. The firekeeper would use a stick to bank the ash over the coals, a technique that preserved the heat for hours. It was a rhythmic, sleepy process. The sound of a single log being turned over, a soft clink and a hiss of wood gas was the heartbeat of the home. For everyone else sleeping in the circle, that sound was the ultimate lullaby. It meant someone was watching. It meant the circle was unbroken. But the night watch wasn't just about physical heat. It was about spiritual heat. Many tribes believed that during the long, dark winter nights, the veil between the physical world and the spirit world got a little thinner, mostly because everyone was half dreaming anyway. To keep the bad air or restless spirits away, the firekeeper might smudge the area with a bit of sweetgrass. Sweetgrass has a scent that is almost impossible to describe if you haven't smelt it. It's like vanilla, dried hay, and a summer afternoon all wrapped into one. In the middle of a sub-zero January night, that smell was a psychological weapon. It reminded your brain that summer actually existed and would eventually return. It kept the winter blues or the cabin fever at bay while you drifted in and out of consciousness. Let's flute over to the concept of the sleep story. Sometimes, if the wind was particularly loud, the firekeeper or a parent would begin a low rhythmic chant or a repetitive story. These weren't stories with plots or climaxes. They were more like vocal loops. They would describe the journey of a river or the way a specific animal moved through the grass. The goal was to provide a focal point for the mind so it wouldn't fixate on the howling wind outside. It was ancient lo-fi beats to sleep to. You'd hear the same phrases repeated over and over, the voice never rising above a whisper until the rhythm of the words matched the rhythm of your breathing. There's a certain irony in how we view survival today as this high-intensity, adrenaline-fueled struggle. For the people in these winter camps, survival was about the opposite. It was about lowering the intensity. It was about being as still and as efficient as possible. If you moved too much, you lost heat. If you got excited, you wasted energy. The most successful survivors were the ones who could be the most relaxed. They were the masters of the low energy state. They were essentially hibernating while remaining awake. And then there was the thaw-out ritual for the morning. You didn't just jump out of bed when the sun came up. That would be a shock to the system that no one wanted. The transition from the warm cocoon of the bison robe to the chilly air of the lodge was done in stages. First, the fire was stoked back into a cheerful blaze. Then someone would put a pot of water or snow on the rocks to boil. The steam would add much-needed humidity to the dry winter air, making it easier to breathe. Only when the indoor temperature had climbed back to a respectable level would people start to emerge from their furs. The first meal of the day was always something warm and liquid, maybe a broth made from marrow bones and dried roots. It was designed to warm you from the inside out, kickstarting your metabolism for the day's chores. But even as the camp woke up, the sleepy energy of the winter remained. In the winter, there was no rush. The sun was only up for a few hours, so you did what you had to do, fix a robe, sharpen a tool, tell a joke, and then you started preparing for the next long snooze. Imagine being there in that transition moment. The sky outside is a pale, icy blue. The teepee is filled with the scent of sweetgrass, wood smoke, and a hint of marrow broth. You're still half tucked into your furs, watching the light filter through the smoke hole. You feel incredibly heavy, incredibly safe, and strangely connected to the people snoring softly around you. The world is frozen, but you are a part of a small, warm, resilient island of life. It makes our modern world feel a bit frantic, doesn't it? We have heaters that click and clack and glowing phone screens that keep our brains buzzing. We've lost that rhythmic, communal watch over the embers. But the next time you're lying in bed and you hear the wind rattle your window, just imagine you have a firekeeper nearby. Imagine the scent of cedar and the weight of a bison robe. The cold is just the backdrop for the warmth you've built. As we move toward the final part of our journey, we'll look at the grand winter dreams, how these long periods of sleep and darkness influence the culture and the art of the people. But for now, just let the firekeeper bank the coals, let the sweetgrass smoke drift toward the ceiling. You have nothing to do but stay warm, and you are doing an excellent job of it.
The architecture of winter dreams. So, we've made it through the logistics of the fire, the layers of the buffalo robes, and the communal warmth of the midnight watch. Now we have to look at what happens to the mind when it's tucked away in a dark, warm cocoon for 14 hours a day. When the physical world shrinks down to the diameter of a teepee or the length of a longhouse, the internal world, the world of dreams, tends to expand to fill the space. In many indigenous cultures, winter wasn't just a season of survival, it was the dreaming season. It was the time when the soul did the heavy lifting, while the body remained perfectly, lazily still. Because there was so little light and so much time spent in that half-awake, half-asleep state, the line between reality and the dream world became very thin and very porous. Of course it did. If you're lying in a dim space, listening to the rhythmic breathing of your family and the low hiss of cedar embers, your brain is naturally going to drift into some pretty interesting places. But for the people of the plains and the woodlands, these weren't just dreams. They were considered a form of travel. They were messages from the ancestors or the land itself, whispered during the hours when the cold had silenced the rest of the world. The winter dream was a specific psychological phenomenon because the diet was high in fats and proteins and the environment was one of extreme sensory deprivation, just the white snow outside and the brown leather inside. Dreams became incredibly vivid. Elders would often encourage children to remember their winter travels. In the morning, while huddled around that first warm pot of broth, the family wouldn't just talk about what they needed to do that day. They would talk about where they went in their sleep. It was like a 19th century version of a morning podcast, but much more personal and a lot more mysterious. This culture of dreaming was actually a very practical way to keep from going stir-crazy. When you're trapped in a small space with the same 10 people for 4 months, you need an escape valve. Dreams provided that. They were a way to go outside without actually freezing your nose off. If someone dreamt of a summer meadow or a successful hunt in a far-off valley, that dream was shared with the group. It acted as a collective morale booster. It reminded everyone that the world was still big, still green, and still waiting for them once the ice finally decided to crack. But let's float over to the concept of winter storytelling again, because this is where the dreams were codified into mythology. There were certain stories that were only allowed to be told when there was snow on the ground. Why? Because some spirits were thought to be asleep in the winter, and you could talk about them without attracting their attention. Or, more practically, because these stories were so long and so complex that you needed the infinite patience of a blizzard to finish them. The storyteller's voice was the ultimate sleep-inducing tool. It wasn't theatrical. It was a low, steady drone, almost like the wind itself.
They would use repetitive phrases and recursive plot lines, where the hero does the same thing 3 or 4 times with only slight variations. If you've ever tried to stay awake through a long, repetitive story while wrapped in a warm blanket, you know exactly what the goal was here. It was a form of hypnotic induction. The storyteller wasn't just sharing history. They were weaving a blanket of sound that wrapped around the listeners, pulling them deeper into their furs and closer to sleep. And then there's the irony of the winter meltdown. We often think of cabin fever as a modern invention, but the indigenous people had their own versions of it, and their cure was, you guessed it, more sleep and more ritual. If someone became irritable or heavy-hearted, the solution wasn't to go for a run in the cold. It was to undergo a dream-seeking session. They would be given specific herbal teas, maybe a bit of mugwort or blue vervain, to deepen their sleep. The idea was that the person's spirit was tangled, and only a deep winter dream could unknot it. It's a very gentle, very quiet way of handling mental health. No shouting, no stress, just a long, guided nap in a scent-filled room. As the winter progressed, the art of the camp changed too. People would spend their waking hours decorating the inside of their robes or carving small, intricate charms out of bone or wood. This was slow art. There was no deadline. You might spend 3 weeks carving a single owl on a needle case. This meditative work kept the hands busy, but the mind relaxed. It was a state of flow that mirrored the slow growth of the ice outside. Everything was measured. Everything was quiet. The most fascinating part of this ancient snooze is how it contrasts with our modern obsession with productivity. We feel guilty if we sleep past 8 o'clock. They felt successful if they stayed warm and rested until the sun was high. They understood that the human body is part of the seasons. If the bears are sleeping and the trees are dormant and the rivers are locked in ice, why should humans be running around trying to achieve things? The greatest achievement of a winter day was maintaining the peace of the lodge and the warmth of the bed. So, as we reach the end of our long, slow journey through the winter camps, I want you to imagine the final stage of a Great Plains winter. The snow is starting to feel a bit heavier, a bit wetter. The air has a different scent, just a hint of damp earth underneath the ice. But inside the teepee, the routine remains. The bison robe is still heavy, the firekeeper is still banking the coals, the dreams are still vivid and long. You're lying there, feeling the weight of the history around you. You aren't just one person sleeping in a tent. You're part of a lineage of people who mastered the art of being still. You realize that the cold isn't an enemy to be fought. It's a curtain that the world pulls shut so you can finally get some rest. The wind can howl all it wants. It can't get through the hides, it can't get through the liners, and it certainly can't get through the deep rhythmic peace of a mind that has surrendered to the winter. The teepee leans slightly in a fresh gust of wind, and the leather creaks like the hull of a ship. It's a safe sound. It's the sound of a home that knows how to bend so it doesn't break. You close your eyes, and the scent of sweet grass and old deerskin pulls you down into one last great winter dream. You're walking through a forest of cedar, and the ground is soft, and the sun is warm, and you have all the time in the world to get where you're going. But for now, you're right here. You're warm, you're safe, and the fire is just right. Sleep well.
The anatomy of the winter camp and the silence of the great sleep. So we have drifted through the dreams and the wardrobes, but now we must settle into the physical layout, the quiet, geometric reality of the winter camp itself. You see, how you arranged your home in relation to your neighbor was just as important as how many buffalo robes you had piled on your feet. When the Great Plains or the northern forests turned into a landscape of white marble and jagged ice, the tribe didn't just scatter, they huddled into a very specific, very intentional formation.
It was a masterpiece of social and thermal engineering designed to turn the entire village into one giant sleeping organism that could breathe through a blizzard. Imagine looking down from above at a camp nestled in a river valley. They always chose the valleys, of course, because the bluffs and the thickets of cottonwood trees acted as a natural windbreak. Up on the flat prairie, the wind was a sharp scythe. Down in the valley, it was just a low, constant murmur. The tipis were arranged in a tight circle, or a camp screen, with the openings usually facing east. Why east? Because the winter winds almost always screamed in from the north or the west. By facing the rising sun, you caught the very first rays of morning light, that pale, weak, but incredibly welcome gold, while keeping your back firmly turned to the teeth of the gale. The irony of this setup is that it created a microclimate in the center of the camp. The circle of tents trapped a pool of relatively still air. Even if it was blowing 60 miles per hour on the ridge above, in the center of the village, you could walk from one teepee to another without feeling like you were being blasted into the next century. This was crucial for the social sleep. In the winter, you didn't just live in your tent, you lived in the community's collective warmth. Inside the teepee, the organization was even more precise. Everything had a place, and that place was usually determined by how much heat it could hold. The honor spot was at the back, opposite the door. This was the warmest part of the tent, furthest from the drafts and closest to the rising heat reflected off the liner. This is where the elders and the most vulnerable slept. The sides of the teepee were lined with parfleches, tough rawhide bags filled with dried food and extra clothes. These weren't just storage, they were insulation. A wall of bags filled with dried meat and furs is basically a second wall. It stopped the cold from seeping through the bottom of the hide. And then there's the floor, the foundation of the snooze. Before the first snow even hit, the ground inside was prepared. They didn't just sleep on the dirt. They would clear the area and then lay down a thick carpet of pine boughs with sweet-smelling prairie grass. On top of that went the woven mats, and on top of those went the heavy hides. By the time you actually lay down, you were essentially floating on a 6-inch cushion of organic insulation. It was springy, it smelled like the woods, and most importantly, it kept the frost ghosts from stealing your body heat from below. But let's talk about the long night rituals, those little things people did when they woke up at 3 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep immediately. In a world without books or smartphones, what did you do in a dark tent? You listened. You listened to the voice of the teepee. Leather is a living material. It expands and contracts. It groans when the wind hits it and pops when the frost tightens the seams. To a trained ear, these sounds were a weather report. If the leather sounded tight, you knew the temperature was dropping. If it sounded soft, the thaw was coming. During these quiet hours, people would often engage in finger work. This was a very specific, low-energy activity. In the near darkness, by the light of a single coal, an artisan might feel their way through a pattern of quill work or beadwork. It was tactile. It was meditative. The repetitive motion of the hands kept the blood moving in the fingers without waking up the rest of the body. It was a way to pass the time that felt like a bridge between the waking world and the dream world. The humor of the winter camp was also a tool for survival. You'd think that being trapped together would lead to constant fighting, but the snarky aside was actually a safety valve. If someone snored too loud, or if a dog kept stealing the blankets, it was handled with a dry, quiet wit. "Oh, is the great hunter trying to call the bison with his nose again?" a grandmother might whisper from her corner. These little jokes kept the atmosphere light. They prevented the winter heaviness from settling into the heart, because once you lose your sense of humor in the cold starts to win. There was also a deep respect for the silence of the snow. Have you ever noticed how quiet it gets after a heavy snowfall? The snowflakes trap sound waves, turning the world into a giant recording studio. In the winter camp, this silence was sacred. People spoke in lower tones. They moved with a deliberate, soft-footed grace. The whole camp hummed with a sort of muted energy.
It was a time for internal reflection, for thinking about the ancestors, and for planning the moves of the coming spring. One of the most interesting things about how they slept was the sun watching. Even in the middle of winter, the sun was the clock. As soon as that first sliver of light hit the smoke hole, the morning fire was built. But they didn't just rush. They would sit and watch the dust motes dance in that single beam of light. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that the sun was still there, even if it was far away. They would use that time to warm their hands and prepare for the few hours of work they had to do, checking the traps, fetching water from the ice hole, or tending to the horses. Then, as the sun began to dip back down again, which happened early, around 4 p.m., the pre-sleep would begin all over again. The camp would retreat back into its leather shells, the fires would be banked, the heavy robes would be pulled up to the chin, the dogs would find their spots. It was a cycle that felt as old as the mountains. Imagine the feeling of that routine. No deadlines, no alarms, just the natural rhythm of the light and the temperature. You aren't fighting the clock, you're living inside it. The winter is a giant white blanket that the Great Spirit has thrown over the world so that everything can rest, and you are right there, tucked in the folds of that blanket, safe and sound. As we move towards the final conclusion of our journey into the ancient snooze, we'll look at the breaking of the ice, how the first signs of spring were greeted not with a burst of energy, but with a slow, grateful awakening. But for now, just let the silence of the snow settle over you. Feel the springy grass beneath your furs and the steady, low heat of the banked fire. The wind is just a ghost outside your walls. You are warm. You are sheltered. You are exactly where you need to be. Sleep is coming, and it is as deep as the drifts outside.
The thaw and the legacy of the long rest. So, we have finally reached the end of the long night. The moon has crossed the sky 100 times, the bison robes have become like a second skin, and the stories have been told so often that the children can recite them in their sleep. But then, one morning, something feels different. It's not a dramatic change. There are no trumpets or sudden heat waves. It's just a subtle shift in the weight of the air. The deep sleep is beginning to crack, just like the ice on the river. And this transition, the slow, groggy awakening of the winter camp, is perhaps the most beautiful part of the whole survival story. It's the moment when the ancient snooze pays its dividends. The first sign isn't usually the sight of grass, but the sound of the teepee itself. Remember how we talked about the leather sounding tight in the freeze? Well, when the thaw begins, the hide begins to breathe. It softens. The frost that had built up on the interior liner begins to turn back into tiny beads of moisture, and the scent of damp earth and old smoke becomes even more intense. It's the smell of a world coming back to life. Of course, the transition isn't immediate. There's usually one last false winter blizzard just to keep everyone humble. But the people in the camp know the truth. They can feel it in their marrow. The breaking of the ice wasn't just a physical event. It was a psychological one. You'd see the elders emerge from their tents first, moving slowly, squinting at a sun that finally has a bit of sting back in its rays. They weren't rushing to get back to work. After 3 or 4 months of hibernation, the body doesn't want to sprint, it wants to stretch. You'd see people standing outside their lodges, wrapped in a single lighter robe, just standing, absorbing the vitamin D like ancient leather-clad solar panels. There's no snark in these moments, just a profound, quiet gratitude that the circle has closed once again. Think about the physical state of these people as they woke up from their long winter sleep. In the modern world, we think of winter as a time of sickness and depletion. But for the tribes who mastered the art of the teepee and the wigwam, spring often found them surprisingly rested. Because they had leaned into the darkness instead of fighting it, because they had slept 14 hours a day and eaten high-fat pemmican and stayed hydrated with herbal teas, they didn't have the burnout we feel today. They were primed.
Their muscles were rested, their minds were full of new dreams, and their social bonds were tighter than ever. They had literally survived by being the most relaxed people on the planet. As the snow retreated, the nighttime wardrobe we discussed earlier was carefully cleaned and tucked away. The heavy bison robes were beaten to remove the winter dust and then stored in cedar-lined parfleches to keep the moths away. The three-dog night was over, and the dogs were probably quite happy to be back outside, chasing ground squirrels instead of acting as furry foot warmers. The camp would begin to shift, moving away from the sheltered river valleys and back out toward the open plains or the high summer forests. But they carried the winter with them. The stories that were born in the huddle of the teepee became the laws and the maps for the summer. The winter dreams were analyzed and turned into plans for the hunt or the migration. It's an ironic contrast to our modern life. We treat sleep as a reset button that we hit so we can go back to work. They treated sleep as the source code of their entire existence. The long snooze wasn't a break from life, it was the foundation of it. As the fires in the winter camp were finally allowed to go out, replaced by the bright, hot cooking fires of the spring, the silence of the snow was replaced by the chaotic symphony of the prairie. The meadowlarks returned, the rivers roared with meltwater, and the thunder began to roll in from the west. But even in the heat of a July afternoon, a person might look at a teepee pole and remember the sound of the winter wind. They'd remember the weight of the fur, the smell of the bergamot tea, and the feeling of absolute safety in a world of ice. There's a profound lesson in this for us, huddling in our climate-controlled boxes, staring at our glowing blue screens. We've forgotten how to be dormant. We've forgotten that it's okay, even necessary, to shrink our world down when the environment gets harsh. We try to live at summer speed all year round, and we wonder why we're so tired. Perhaps the secret to not freezing to death isn't just about the thickness of the leather or the heat of the fire. Perhaps it's about the willingness to be still, to be quiet, to let the dog sleep on your feet and the storyteller drone on until your eyes get heavy. So, as we conclude this long, sleepy monologue, I want you to take one last look at that imaginary winter camp. The sun is setting on the last day of the frost. The smoke from the teepees is rising straight up into a purple sky because the wind has finally died down. The people are beginning to pack their things, but they're not in a hurry. They're moving with the deliberate, calm grace of someone who has mastered the art of the snooze. You can feel that same grace now. The bed you're in is your teepee. Your blankets or your bison robes. The hum of your fan or your heater is just the wind in the cottonwoods. You have everything you need to survive the night. You have the warmth of your home, the quiet of the hour, and the deep, ancient permission to just stop. The winter is over, or perhaps it's just beginning. It doesn't really matter, because you know how to handle it now. You know that the cold is just an invitation to go deeper into the dream. You know that the darkness is just a blanket. So, go ahead and let your breathing match the rhythm of that ancient firekeeper. Let your thoughts drift away like the sweetgrass smoke through the smoke hole. The world outside is vast and complicated, but your world right here is small, warm, and perfectly still. You are wrapped in layers of history and comfort. You are safe. You are rested. The long night is finally leaning into the morning, but you don't have to wake up just yet. You can stay right here in the soft, furry heart of the ancient snooze for as long as you like. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and may your winter dreams be full of summer meadows. Good night.
The echo of the winter count and the final ember. So we have watched the snow melt and the dogs return to the sun. But there is one final piece of the winter snooze we haven't touched upon, the winter count.
You see, while the body was resting and the mind was dreaming, the history of the people was being etched into the very hides that kept them warm. In many plains tribes, the winter was the time for the keeper of the count to sit down with a specially prepared bison skin and a set of natural pigments. This wasn't a hectic record-keeping session. It was a slow, deliberate distillation of an entire year into a single, quiet image. And as you lie there, drifting on the edge of sleep, it's worth thinking about how a whole year of life can be captured in a single, silent symbol while the blizzard rages outside. The winter count was the ultimate slow history. Because the winter nights were so long, there was no need to rush the narrative. The keeper would look back over the past 4 seasons, the hunts of the summer, the migrations of the autumn, the births and the losses, and he would choose one event, just one. This event would be painted in a spiral, starting from the center of the hide and working outward. It was a visual representation of time itself, moving in a slow, sleepy circle. Imagine the scene. The interior of the teepee is dim, lit only by the golden pulse of the embers. The keeper dips a small bone stylus into a mixture of red ochre and animal fat. He isn't painting a masterpiece for a gallery. He's painting a reminder for the grandchildren. He might paint a small figure of a horse to represent the year the tribe gained a new herd, or a simple star to represent a meteor shower that everyone watched from their teepee openings. The act of painting was a ritual of reflection. It turned the chaos of a year into a manageable, peaceful memory. It was the final step in the winter's work of settling the soul. This is the irony of the nomadic life that people often miss. We think of it as a life of constant movement, but the winter was a period of profound stability. The winter count hide was like a physical manifestation of the communal memory, and it lived right there in the tent with you. You would fall asleep looking at the history of your people, literally wrapped in the stories of your ancestors. It provided a sense of continuity that a modern, fast-paced life often lacks. You weren't just a person trying to stay warm. You were a single point on a spiral that had been turning for centuries. But let's talk about the spirit of the ember one last time. As the winter came to a close and the winter count was updated, there was a final ceremony involving the fire itself. They believed that the fire that burned all winter wasn't just a chemical reaction. It was a guest. It was a living entity that had protected the family. When it was finally time to move the camp, the coals weren't just doused with water and forgotten. A small amount of the ash was often collected in a pouch. This mother ash would be carried to the next camp, a symbolic thread connecting the warmth of the past to the warmth of the future. It's a beautiful thought to fall asleep to, isn't it? The idea that warmth isn't something you just create and throw away, but something you carry with you. Even as you move through your own life from one day to the next, you're carrying the embers of your experiences. The lessons you learned in your own personal winters, those times of quiet and hardship, are the very things that keep you warm during the next cold snap. And what about the silence? We've mentioned it before, but the silence of the winter camp was a specific kind of heavy silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of peace. In our modern world, we are terrified of silence. We fill it with podcasts, music, and the hum of machines. But the people of the teepee embraced it. They knew that silence is where the dreams grow. They knew that if you listen closely enough to the silence of a frozen forest, you can hear your own heart beating. You can hear the earth breathing under the snow. As you lie there now, try to find that silence. Let the sounds of your room, the distant hum of a car, the ticking of a clock, fade into the background. Imagine they are just the sounds of the Great Plains wind, far away and unable to reach you. You are in your own winter count now. What would your symbol for this year be? Perhaps it's just this moment of rest. Perhaps your symbol is a single glowing coal, representing the peace you found in the middle of a busy world. The legacy of the Native American winter sleep isn't just a set of survival skills, it's a philosophy of being. It's the realization that we don't always have to be doing something to be valuable. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay warm and stay quiet. The world will still be there when the ice melts. The bison will still be on the hills. The sun will still rise in the east. But for now, the only thing that matters is the weight of the blanket and the softness of the pillow. The firekeeper has finally lain down his tools. The smoke flaps are adjusted one last time. The dogs have all stopped twitching in their sleep. The entire village is a collection of dark, silent cones under a blanket of stars so bright they look like ice crystals. There is no more talk of hunting or travel. There is only the rhythm of 100 people breathing in unison, a slow, steady tide of life against a frozen shore of the world. You are part of that tide now. You are drifting on the same current that carried the people of the teepee through 1,000 winters. The air around you is perfectly still. Your muscles have completely let go of the day. You are as heavy and as grounded as an earth lodge, and as light and as free as a winter dream. The spiral of the winter count is moving inward now, toward the center, toward the point of absolute rest. There is no more story to tell. There is only the feeling of being safe. There is only the warmth. Let the last ember of the fire go dark. The light is needed no more, because you are already seeing with the eyes of a dreamer. The snow is falling softly outside the walls of your mind, burying all your worries, all your tasks, and all your stress with a thick white layer of peace. Sleep is the final destination of this journey, and you have arrived. The teepee is quiet. The fire is ash. The world is a memory.
The philosophy of the drift and the eternal hearth. So, we have reached a place where the history books usually stop, but where the sleepless historian likes to linger just a little bit longer. We've talked about the physical hides, the herbal teas, and the communal dogs, but now we have to talk about the long quiet. There is a specific kind of wisdom that comes from spending half your life in the dark, waiting for the sun to remember your name. It's a philosophy of the drift, the understanding that life isn't a straight line from point A to point B, but a series of circles that expand and contract with the temperature. And as you lie there, feeling the weight of your own blankets, it's worth considering that the perfect sleep isn't just about comfort. It's about surrendering to the fact that you are not in control of the seasons. In the modern world, we fight the seasons. We turn on the lights when it's dark. We turn on the heat when it's cold. We demand that every day be exactly like the one before it. But the people of the teepee and the wigwam didn't fight. They leaned. They understood that winter was a necessary death for the world, and that by mimicking that death through deep, prolonged sleep, they were actually preparing for a more vibrant life. This is the secret of the ancient snooze. It wasn't just a way to kill time, it was a spiritual recalibration. Imagine the mental clarity that comes after a week of blizzard-induced isolation. You haven't seen the horizon in days. Your world is 12 feet wide. You've heard the same stories, smelled the same cedar, and eaten the same dried meat. For us, this sounds like a nightmare of boredom. For them, it was a monastery of the plains. It was a time to prune away the unnecessary thoughts of the summer. In the stillness of the winter lodge, you realized that you didn't need much to be whole. You needed a fire, a story, and the person sleeping next to you. Everything else was just summer noise. And then there's the matter of time slipping. When you sleep as much as they did in the winter, the days begin to blur together in a very pleasant, hazy way.
You lose track of whether it's Tuesday or Thursday. Not that those words meant anything to them, but you gain a sense of deep time. You start to feel the movement of the stars through the smoke hole. You start to anticipate the exact moment the wind is going to shift just by the way the air feels against your cheek. You become a part of the landscape. You aren't in the winter, you are the winter. This state of being is what allowed them to wake up in the spring without the crankiness of the modern person. They hadn't been fighting a battle for 4 months. They had been participating in a ritual. Even the way they spoke during these long nights was different. Languages like Lakota or Ojibwe have a rhythmic, tonal quality that feels like it was designed to be whispered in a dark room. The words themselves are heavy and slow. As you listen to the sounds of the night now, imagine those words floating through the air, vibrating softly against the leather walls. They are words of protection, words of history, and words of absolute, unshakable peace. The irony of our advanced civilization is that we spend thousands of dollars on sleep hygiene apps and white noise machines to try and replicate what they had for free. We try to buy the silence that they lived in every day, but you can't buy it. You have to earn it by being still. You have to earn it by letting the fire burn down and trusting that the morning will come without your help. Let's think about the very last ember in the very last teepee of the camp. The keeper has finally closed his eyes. The mother ash is tucked away in its pouch. The snow has piled up so high against the sides of the tent that it's actually silent inside, dead silent. The kind of silence that feels like a physical weight on your chest, but a comfortable weight, like a heavy quilt. In this silence, the distinction between the person and the environment vanishes. The heat of your body is the heat of the earth. The breath in your lungs is the wind outside. You are part of a giant, frozen, beautiful machine that is currently at rest. There is a finality to this part of the story. We've gone from the construction of the tent to the deep philosophy of the soul. We've covered everything from bison poop to spiritual dreams, and yet the core of the story remains the same: a human being, a blanket, and the cold. It's the most basic human experience there is. It's what connects us to the people of the 1700s and the 10,000s BC, and hopefully to the people of the future. The need for a safe place to close our eyes is the one thing we all share. As the sleepless historian, I like to think that these ancient sleepers are still out there in a way. Their stories are etched into the landscape. Their wisdom is in the way the cedar smells when it burns, and their long rest is something we can all tap into if we just learn to dim the lights and stop worrying about the summer for a while. The winter camp is moving now. In your mind, you can see the teepees being taken down, the poles being bundled, and the people moving out into the greening world. But they are moving with a secret. They are moving with the strength of 100 nights of perfect sleep. They are moving with the clarity of 1,000 dreams, and they are carrying that mother ash with them, ready to start the fire all over again when the circle turns back to the cold. But you don't have to move. Your camp is right here. Your fire is banked perfectly. The winter count of your life has a new symbol tonight, a symbol of rest, of learning, and of quiet. You have listened to the long monologue of history, and it has done its job. It has wrapped you in a blanket of words and led you to the edge of the woods. The sun is a long way off. The stars are in their places. The dogs are quiet. The leather is soft. The tea is finished. The story is told. There is nothing left to do but let go of the last thread of the waking world. Let the philosophy of the drift take you where it wants to go. You are floating on a river of bison robes and cedar smoke, and the current is very, very gentle. It's taking you toward the deep sleep, the place where the history books are blank and the dreams are the only reality. You are warm, you are safe, you are part of the circle. Close your eyes now. The firekeeper has finished his watch. The night is yours. Good night.